Good afternoon, or good day. Actually, it's 12 noon. I'm John Swile, the new executive director of the Peale, Baltimore's Community Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the last talk in this year's It's More Than History lecture series, sponsored by the Baltimore National Heritage Area and presented by the Peale. This is the fourth year we've brought this series to people, and we're thrilled to keep it going. Today's event, the B&O Railroad and the Emerging Nation, features a presentation by Jonathan Goldman, Chief Curator at the B&O Railroad Museum. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's online program is being recorded. The discussion will be available after the program on the Peale's YouTube channel in about a week. Please keep your mics on mute until the end of the program when we ask for questions. You can add those questions to the chat at any time, and we'll try to answer them during the chat session after the presentation. We'll have an ASL interpreter with us throughout the discussion and chat, as you can see. You can also turn on closed captions in your Zoom toolbar. I'd like to add that accessibility is a core value at the Peale, so you will find almost all of our programs are ASL interpreted and captioned, so please tell your friends. Our aim is to be as accessible to everyone as possible. The Peale's mission is still about amplifying and sharing the voices and stories that too often have been overlooked or intentionally erased from the historical record. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the Peale in Baltimore stands on the traditional ancestral lands of a number of indigenous peoples, including the Piscataway and the Susquehannock. Our work is ongoing to better understand the pre-colonial history of our city and region, and also to support the indigenous peoples who are part of our communities today. You can pick up your free copy of the illustrated guide to East Baltimore's historic American Indian reservation walking tour map from the Peale, and also download the guide to Indigenous Baltimore app for free. I'd like to thank Brian Coons and the Maryland State Arts Council for the land acknowledgement references they have made available to us, and to the local leaders like Ashley Minor Jones for ensuring that Indigenous voices are heard and recognized in Baltimore today. Now I'm happy to introduce Kenyana Moore, Outreach Coordinator at the Baltimore National Heritage Area. Kenyana, thank you once again for allowing the Peale to present these compelling and insightful talks in the It's More Than History Lunchtime lecture series. Please, Kenyana, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kenyana Moore. I am the Outreach Manager and the Office Manager at the Baltimore National Heritage Area. Thank you for joining us for the March and the last leg of the It's More Than History lecture series. The purpose of the lecture series is to tell historical relevant stories by experts in their fields. We run this series annually for the months of February, March, and April. Check out our other lectures and stories on the Peale YouTube channel. Stay connected to BNHA on Facebook. We have our Instagram and the website at explorebaltimore.org. Today's lecture again is entitled The B&O Railroad and the Emerging Nation, presented by Mr. John Goldman, curator at the B&O Railroad Museum. Jonathan joined the B&O Railroad in September of 2019 as chief curator and provides leadership and management of the museum's interpretation, exhibition, collections, archives, restoration, and educational teams, ensuring both the care of the museum's unparalleled objects as well as producing engaging programming and experiences for visitors. Jonathan has worked in the museum field for over 13 years, developing impact-driven exhibitions, improving care. He also received a BA in Asian Studies from Occidental College, a B.F.A. in Art Design and Decoration from the Social Impact Center College and Designs. He has an MA in Exhibition Designs from George Washington University. Jonathan has taught at George Washington University and currently is an adjunct professor at Towson University. We'd like to thank Mr. Goldman for his presentation today. If you'd like to know more about the B&O Railroad, please visit the museum. We also have a wonderful exhibit on the Underground Railroad. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Kenyana, and thank you everybody for inviting me to do this talk. I excited to share with you some more information about history that's right in our backyard here in Baltimore. Let me share my screen. All right. So hopefully you can see that. The B&O Railroad and the Emerging Nation. I have to say, once I got started, I realized that I had to zoom out a little bit to just railroading and the emerging nation in general, which I feel like was okay because the B&O was the first major railroad. And so it proved that railroading worked. So everything that followed maybe is the legacy of the B&O. So I work at the B&O Railroad Museum. There's a picture inside our roundhouse. We have a 42-acre campus with an entrance on Pratt Street, just west of MLK. We have 8 buildings, 200 locomotives and rail cars, a huge railroading archives and collection, and a operational railroad that still takes passengers down the first mile of commercial track in the United States. So our site is the site where America's first railroad was founded and created. I sort of have this spiel I give every time I talk, which is having worked here now for 5 years or so, I've come to see the railroad as the original technological network of the country. It's like the internet of the 1800s in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of parallels. It was literally a technological network that connected our country in a new way and created all new ways of doing commerce, telecommunications, time, and travel. So it just changed everything, and at great speeds. So it had the effect of shrinking the world, just like computers and internet did in my lifetime. So, before the invention of the railroad, the speed limit of land travel was that of a horse, which is about 7 miles per hour going long distance. So here, the tom thumb on the left, it's represented here. It went a whopping 13 miles per hour, and it was the first American-made locomotive made by Peter Cooper here in Baltimore. And very, very quickly, the technology got better and better and better. Just about 30 years later, when the Civil War is breaking out, we have locomotives going at speeds that we would think, our modern locomotives go. So it's an exponential growth like the internet as well. Okay, so the origins of the railroad. Why did we need a railroad? How did it come about? This is the wordiest slide I have. I really like just pictures. So the B&O Railroad was chartered in February 1827 and founded on our site, which is called Mount Clair, where the museum is today. So that means in 2027, we will be celebrating the 200th anniversary of American railroading. And we are hoping to come out with a lot for the city, for the state, for the country to celebrate that. It was America's first common carrier railroad, meaning a railroad company in the way we think of it today, for public use to transport passengers and freight. There were some industrial railroads like mines that had track prior to the B&O, but it wasn't sort of a railroad company like we think of today. And it was founded by the business community here in Baltimore, the city, and the state of Maryland. So actually it was an early example of a public-private partnership. And its mission is in its name. It was to connect Baltimore to Ohio, but the Ohio River, not the state. And that would connect the port of Baltimore in the Atlantic Ocean to the river network in the middle of our continent. So goods could be transported basically from England to New Orleans through the country, right? So we're looking at sort of the 1820s and 1830, and these are sort of the 4 major ports of the northeast here of our country. And I highlighted here this population chart. We're basically Philly and Baltimore were going back and forth as second and third largest city in the country during this time period. So by 1827, Baltimore may have been the second largest city in the country, but not by much. So on one hand, it was a very, very important port at this time just because it was a major city. But another thing to look at is, and you can see on this map, land transportation was the hardest means of transportation available at that time. So, a boat could go much faster than a horse and cart over a dirt road. So, if you look at the map, Baltimore with the Chesapeake, because of the Chesapeake Bay, is actually the most west of all the major ports at this time, meaning it reduced land travel to take goods back and forth from the interior of the continent. And so that made it a very attractive port. And that's a lot of the growth that Baltimore saw at that time was due to that. Prior to the railroad, the National Road was built. They say it's the first federal highway that went from Cumberland out to Illinois. And then a turnpike was created, or a pike, to Baltimore to connect the harbor. It was sort of a continuation, but I believe the difference was it was a toll road up until Cumberland. But it actually went down Pratt Street from the harbor and out west. And so it was sort of a major thoroughfare to connect goods by wagon. So by the 1820s, different cities are beginning to build canals. As I mentioned, boats were faster than going by land. And so the solution was to make man-made rivers, essentially, to transport goods. The only problem for Baltimore is that it requires a river to go in the direction you want to go because it sort of parallels the river. So Washington started building one, Philadelphia, New York, they're all getting these canals, but Baltimore can't build a canal. And so that's when the business leaders get nervous that Baltimore is going to be cut out of this canal economy. So we're talking about Johns Hopkins, Patterson, McKim, names we still see around town today. And and actually Alexander Brown of Alexander Brown and Sons was a part of this meeting too, and actually hosted one of the first meetings where they all got together and said, we heard of, this is like 1826, late 1826. Railroads had just been invented in England in 1825. And so they were getting word of how great this technology was. And they sent a couple people to go look at it and sort of write down how it works and brought it back. And anyway, they decided by February 1827 that we were going to actually pursue America's first railroad because we couldn't build the canal. So by 1835, this is the B&O, full B&O network. Baltimore is connected to Harper's Ferry, which was a major engineering feat to cross the Potomac there and go into Harper's Ferry. And we've also connected Washington and Baltimore. As I mentioned, this was a major engineering feat in early America where they had to figure out new ways of building things. England's rail system, for the most part in the beginning, was going over very flat land. But this, on the right here, this is Thomas Viaduct out near BWI. And already coming out of Baltimore, they had to build this monumental curved stone viaduct to put the tracks on. And actually, this bridge is still there today, and it was built so solidly in 1835 that CSX is still running freight trains over it. It's still in use. And so we had people like the Latrobe's brothers, one of which designed the U.S. Capitol building. They were involved in the surveying, designing, and running of this early railroad. And so we have some major figures involved in designing this. Peter Cooper, a major engineer working on the locomotives. So I talked about the exponential growth of railroad. Once the railroad got proven as very efficient and very quick and probably better than a canal, the canals sort of got abandoned, and instead people were investing in railroads. And so you can see here from 1830 to 1840 to 1850, the amount of growth in the railroad network and how fast that was. And I actually keep going here. So by 1870, this is just after the Civil War, we've connected the entire continent and the network is really growing. And then here by 1890, look at that. It's very full. So we're talking over 60, 70 years, right? And so, of course, this had an effect of bridging and binding our nation in a whole new way and connecting people in a whole new way. So before I get into the network, I want to talk about the people who built the railroad and how that relates to migrations. All the southern railroads south of the Potomac River and from the East Coast to all the way west to Texas potentially was using enslaved people to build the railroads. And they were building these railroads through very harsh terrain, often through swamps. They were sort of out in camps, and it was a very insecure job. However, they became the ones in the South that had the expertise in building railroads, which we will circle back to later. Another thing that we explore in our museum is the connection between the Underground Railroad and the physical railroad. Our museum, we have documented 27 freedom seekers that used the B&O Railroad, 9 of which who came through our property and here in Baltimore. And this is a secret network of people going north without documentation, right? So if we found 27, then we know that's just the tip of the iceberg. And so at this time, you could travel by steamboat, you could travel by rail, you could travel by horse, or you could travel by foot. That's the entire transportation network of the country. So of course the railroad was used by people on the Underground Railroad. And here and north of here, Irish workers were the primary source of labor for building the railroad. While they were paid, they were probably not paid very well. The B&O's first president, Philip Thomas, was a Quaker. And so one of the first things he did was to say that the B&O and its subcontractors could not use slave labor to build the B&O Railroad. So basically, from the B&O Railroad up, slave labor was not used in this country to build the railroad. So Irish workers were some of the most recent migrants to Baltimore and to the country, so they became the primary labor source for the B&O Railroad. And in fact, the area around our museum was the Irish neighborhood for a long time because it was the workers of the railroad who lived around our site. And then, of course, on the West Coast, we have migrants from Asia, from China, building the Transcontinental Railroad in really harsh conditions for, really, not good pay, not good, I'm blanking on the word, but unfair contracts. I just wanted to mention, since we're talking about all these groups, women, for the most part, were not a part of the railroad for a very long time. We do know about some enslaved women who were building the railroads of the South. But it wasn't until World War I, when all the men were getting drafted or went to war, that the gap was filled by women during that time. And that happened again in World War II. And we also see African American women working on the railroad during World War II a lot more. Of course, they were starting to get clerical jobs and things like that as well. If we continue my computer analogy, the railroads were sort of the high-tech companies of the time. So like the Googles and the Apple. So, the B&O is this high-tech company. And because it was so large, it had a lot of impact on a lot of different sectors of our society. One is because of the dangerous work that was involved in building and maintaining a railroad and running steam engines. The B&O was an early adopter to having health and death benefits for its employees. So kind of like how it works today, you could apply part of your paycheck to buy into the B&O's relief department, and they provided medical care and death benefits and injury benefits um, as they came up. And our museum actually has about 16 million documents of people's health records from the early 1900s through the 1940s. And we're actually working with Johns Hopkins to see if AI can interpret all these papers that go from handwritten to typewriter to, all different kinds of forms. So it's kind of an exciting project that we're in the middle of working on. And of course, this was a precursor to our current insurance program and showed that it could work and that workers wanted that kind of benefit in this country. Going west. So in 1853, the B&O completes its mission and reaches Wheeling, West Virginia on the Ohio River. Of course, they continue to go further west. They make it all the way out to Chicago and St. Louis eventually. But this was the original goal. And so in the beginning, there was more modest goals of freight shipment. Ellicott City was called Ellicott Mills because that's where they milled flour. And so flour for a while became a primary commodity, and it improved trade with sort of the interior of Maryland, and the farmers. They were able to better get their goods to the Baltimore port and sort of open them up to a global network. When we get into Western Maryland, of course, they start hauling coal. And so coal was beyond the fuel with which the engines ran, but it was also a really important commodity for export. And, some people say the United States is the Saudi Arabia of coal. So Baltimore was shipping a lot of coal out, and the current coal port has actually always been the coal port. And basically this coal is getting shipped out to fuel industrialization throughout Europe, and it provided a lot of economic wealth for the country, this coal. But it also was going through the Appalachian Mountains was a major hurdle and challenge from an engineering perspective. But they did go across it, basically hugging the Potomac River. If you're driving down the highway in Western Maryland there, you can actually sort of glimpse the Potomac below sometimes and see where the track and the canal were both being built right next to the river there. And so, of course, when they get to Wheeling, then goods can be transferred to boat, and it opens up the whole country that's on that river network, the Mississippi, the Ohio. And I just, there could be a whole book on how the railroads helped shape early America, but, just making the point that as the country went west, the railroads followed behind it and sort of established an infrastructure and network, sort of solidifying us as one nation with one network. So this is an image I just thought was interesting. Lincoln signs the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862 during the Civil War, sort of opening the door for the Transcontinental Railroad for railroads to get built from the Pacific. And so construction begins in 1863 and ramps up after the Civil War. But, this image, I think, shows a lot. It shows the displacement of Native Americans to make room for the railroad. We have the bison, which, at Western expansion killed most of them. And then we have people going from these wagons and settling to the trains coming in behind it as sort of the established infrastructure. And we have the sort of port and mountain connection here. So yeah, I thought this just said a lot about that. I mentioned we going west created a lot of disruption in the ecology of the United States. This is a mountain here of bison skulls. Um, it says here they were going to grind it into fertilizer. And then here we have a depiction of the Cheyenne Indians tearing up the tracks in resistance to the railroad coming through their land. And many indigenous people were displaced to make room for the railroad and other infrastructure farming needs of the settlers. In 1869, the country is united. The Golden Spike is laid, connecting the East Coast to the West Coast by rail, and really signaling, we are one connected network here in this country. This is a tangent a little bit, but I think it's an interesting story just to show how the railroads are kind of intertwined with American history in many ways, and maybe many unseen ways. Ross Winans here on the left was a really important early engineer. He designed a lot of the locomotives the B&O used. And with all his success, the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I here, in 1842, wanted to build a railroad connecting Moscow to St. Petersburg. And not just like a normal railroad, but like an ultra luxurious railroad that he would want to use to go to St. Petersburg. And so he hired Ross Winans to build this railroad. And it became so expensive. And simultaneously, there's a sort of economic crisis in Russia at the time. And the Tsar is unable to pay the bills for the railroad. And he's going in debt, and they're worried that the country is going to go into bankruptcy. So one way he generated money for this was this debt and other debts was to sell Alaska to the United States. And he sold Alaska for 9 million rubles at the time, with Ross Winans receiving 6.5 million of those rubles from the sale of Alaska to pay off his work. Warfare was also heavily influenced by the railroad. The Civil War was actually the first war in the world to use rail technology, and both the North and the South had railroads. So you can imagine George Washington sending troops from DC to Pennsylvania, probably marching for weeks to get there. And imagine how slow communication about what happened was. Paul Revere on the horse is telling people the British are coming, right? So with the railroad, Lincoln is able to send troops essentially in hours instead of that much time. And we start getting electronic communication along, telegrams being sent along railroad routes through railroad companies. So messages can go back and forth much, much faster. So everything is accelerated a lot. And we can bring supplies in and weapons and move troops in a whole new way. And so one way they waged warfare was to destroy track. And you can see here on the left, they would heat up pieces of rail and bend it. And because of the properties of this metal, you can't unbend it and make it perfectly straight again. So you actually had to totally replace it. So both sides were sabotaging each other all the time, and then both sides had to go out and repair their broken track. During this time, the white male employees of the B&O and the other railroads were going into battle, were going into war, leaving a vacuum to maintain, run, fix, and sabotage the enemy's railroads. So the U.S. Army under Lincoln actually hired 10,000 formerly enslaved African Americans who had experience building the railroads of the South. So they already were railroaders. So they were hired to work on the northern railroads. And we actually think it was the first time the federal government paid Black people for their work. Another major contribution of railroads to the early country was telecommunications. Samuel Morse worked with B&O employees to send the first telegram by Morse code from the U.S. Capitol building in D.C. along the tracks of the B&O to Mount Clair Station, which is on our campus in Baltimore. It's currently where our Underground Railroad exhibit is. And the message said, "What hath God wrought?" So I tell the kids it's the first text message in history. But essentially, this opened the door to instant communication, right? And so, of course, everybody wanted to do this. So the railroads became the pioneers in using their right-of-way to set up wires from station to station, because they also realized they could coordinate the trains a lot better. They could avoid collisions, they could know if something was delayed or broken, and keep the schedules on track. But then they would also provide a public service where people could pay to have a message sent. Eventually, this was privatized or not, or sold off as to private companies. So, like Western Union purchased the B&O's telegram sort of business and took over it. Another major thing that happened was the standardization of time in this country. Prior to the railroads in the 1880s sort of helping establish these time zones and standard time, every major city had its own sundial, and that was the standard time for that city. So New York might have been 10 minutes ahead of DC, let's say. And so they weren't exactly on the same time. But when you're traveling slowly, it doesn't matter if you're 10 minutes off. But if you're traveling in a couple hours, the 10 minutes could make a difference. And so providing schedules of when the train is going to come to your town and leave your town, if you don't have standardized time, then it's wrong or you can't do it. And it also resulted in some head-on collisions where people had the wrong time and were on the same track and would collide. So it became a safety issue as well. And so they established what was called Railroad Standard Time, and the government adopted it in 1883. And it established the 4 time zones we know today in our country, or at least on the continent. And basically on November 18th, master clocks were sent out on the tracks, and the time was adjusted in each city to those clocks. And so, all the railroads sort of created these time service departments. The B&O had a time service department where they were in charge of maintaining this technology of clocks. And so they would have regulator clocks, which usually had a pendulum and were sort of the master clock, keeping the time. And then other clocks that the crews would use would be set off of those clocks. And so, conductors with pocket watches had to, I believe, monthly go in and make sure their pocket watch was aligned with the master clock. And then we also know that stations often had clocks on their towers to sort of establish the standard time for the city residents. So it was an exact science, and they were very good at doing it. And that's why the reputation of the trains always being on time became a thing. And so just to bring it to today, what is the legacy of all this? This is a map of our current rail system. And, you can see those little gray lines behind there. That is part of the rail system as well. The colors are just the major Class 1 railroads. But we have a vast network of rail in this country, primarily used for freight. We don't really think of ourselves like this often. We think of the highway network connecting us all, but rail is a critical piece of our infrastructure in this country, particularly for freight and hopefully in the future for passengers. One case study on sort of this network and how powerful it is, I like to talk about this example, the banana. So actually the B&O built the first or one of the first banana processing plants in the country right on the pier of Fed Hill. So this is an overhead of Fed Hill, and all of these piers here were actually B&O piers, sometimes with B&O ships and sometimes with other company ships. but they would come and load and unload all along the waterfront here. And so they built this banana processing plant, and at the same time, refrigeration or refrigerated cars had been invented. So you could take this tropical fruit from the Caribbean and Central America and transport it by ocean to the United States, to Baltimore, transfer it onto a train, and take it all the way as far as Chicago without the banana spoiling. And you can imagine that how it went from this exotic fruit that you could hardly ever get because how could you get it in time to eat it, to today the most eaten fruit in this country. And we cannot grow bananas in this country. We have no climate able to grow bananas. So I just think it's amazing to think that this tropical fruit is now the most eaten in the country because of refrigeration and our freight network. Sorry, I had a picture of the bananas here in a refrigerated car. Also, how it impacts us today is that we have stopped largely investing in rail infrastructure. So this is the Baltimore and Potomac Tunnel that goes under Baltimore that Amtrak uses to come into Penn Station from the south. It was built in 1873, and we are still using it today. And of course, the curves are very tight. They were designed for smaller trains going at a slower speed. And that's why Amtrak is so keen to build the new tunnel under Baltimore, because they believe they can go much faster between DC and Baltimore and reduce the time between DC and New York by about 20 minutes by speeding up getting through Baltimore. And so a lot of our infrastructure, that bridge I mentioned, this tunnel, were all built in the mid 1800s, and we're still using it today. And so it impacts our speed of passenger rail and things like that. So with that, today our current freight network is responsible for transporting $2 billion a day in goods. And so you can imagine if the rail shuts down, that would be a huge economic impact to our country. And it's really responsible for a lot of commerce. And so thank you. That's what I have today. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was great. I do have a few questions in the chat, starting with, oh, someone was surprised that the railroads led to the purchase of Alaska. So that was an interesting discovery. What was the specific role of the B&O in the Civil War? Troop move for battles in the region, or did they
Or did they what?
march?
So the B&O played a very critical role in the Civil War. It hugs the Potomac River, so it actually was the front of the Union. And the president of the B&O, John Work Garrett, actually became Lincoln's rail advisor for the war effort. And so the B&O and the U.S. Army worked hand in hand during the war. So it was used to transport goods, transport troops, and sometimes even as shields. I mean, they had iron freight cars that you could be, that bullets wouldn't be able to get through. So it was even part of the war sometimes. And actually, we have a locomotive called the Memnon in our roundhouse, which is one of 3 surviving locomotives that saw combat in the Civil War.
That's cool. Another question. What influenced the choice of path for the railroads?
The river, the Potomac River, for the most part, because that was the flattest land going through the Appalachian Mountains. Since the river cut through the mountain, it was the least grade to go up and down. But it did have really tight curves. So sometimes they were building a lot of bridges sometimes because it couldn't make the curve. So it's kind of swerving in and out with the Potomac.
Uh, Interesting. Why do you think most people don't appreciate rail service today?
Because it's slow and expensive. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I think we see places like Japan and Europe with these either cheap networks or fast networks. I know I traveled all around China on trains, and it was amazing and affordable. I just think, Yeah, I mean, I was looking into tickets from New York to Chicago for our family, and it would have cost $3,500
By train.
by train.
Yeah.
As the flight is like 150, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's a good flight if you can get that. That's a little bit under what the average is, but I just don't think maybe we put quite as much investment in the infrastructure and keeping it updated in the US as they have in Europe. We're much more car
Well,
driven, right?
I mean, Amtrak is pseudo-government, but really our rail network is private, which is another part that, the government isn't building passenger rail.
Yeah, there are some exciting new railways like the Bright Line down in Florida that are starting to implement high-speed trains, and I've enjoyed that service between Miami and West Palm. It's very quick and very efficient. What are the plans to celebrate the B&O 200th anniversary?
Coming soon.
Coming
Uh,
soon.
we're gonna, one thing is we're gonna launch, we're trying to invite everybody in the country to celebrate in their own way in their own communities. And we're gonna have a centralized web portal where people can find events near them or where they want to go or things they want to attend. So it's, we are going to do some of our own things, but we also want to just invite the country to also celebrate in their own ways.
Another question. Can you talk a bit more about how wealth from the railroad or railroad wealth, that's a hard two words to say together, shaped Baltimore? Who were the winners and losers? I mean, this is sort of that Gilded Age, right? Where
I mean, this is an example of the rich getting richer, I would say. Um, you know, Charles Carroll of Carrollton was the richest man in the country, and he was a major investor. Alex Brown had a bank, and so he was a financial investor. He became the bank of the whole effort. Johns Hopkins was already wealthy from trade and became much wealthier. So because they were original stockholders and shareholders of this company. The state of Maryland and Baltimore were on the board and had share in this, so they benefited as well until they were bought out. Um, Johns Hopkins, for example, uh, the people don't know this, but he didn't actually give any money to build the hospital or the university. He gave his B&O stocks to build those two institutions. And the
interesting.
money stayed in the family. So that's how much money it was. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Who were the losers? Any big losers of note?
You know, well, people who are displaced.
Yeah.
And so, we're in urban environments. We're going through the B&O didn't really go through the West at all, but we're going through highly urban environments. So things like eminent domain and things like that.
Right. Any lasting impacts from the railroad strike of 1877?
Um, you know, I think that's when they realized that they needed to do better and provide better benefits. So I would say like the relief department and things like that were sort of outcomes from demanding uh, better conditions or pay.
Can you talk more about the research of medical records from the workers?
Yeah. So basically, these boxes that were the corporate medical records of the B&O somehow made their way to the attic of Camden, that the brick building that's part of Camden Yards. That was the freight house, the sort of freight building for the B&O for a long time. And it was in the top floor. So when the Stadium Authority took over, the B&O acquired these records. And 16 million pages is a lot, and they're all in envelopes with people's names and identifying information, and it's private medical data. And so they just kind of sat there because nobody knew how to deal with the sheer scale of it. But we started shopping it around with Hopkins, and it made its way to a historian, a labor historian who's also an AI professor. And so we've been collaborating to experiment with what AI can do to read these documents, understand them, and we can do it in a way that's like acceptable for and accurate in a sort of history archives context. So we're sort of in the middle of the project, And we've been finding money to basically hire interns to rehouse, document, and scan these pages.
Yeah, that's a
Which
Herculean
is,
task with the volume size, right?
yeah, it's a lot.
Are there any legal ramifications? Are any of these people still alive?
No, but Maryland has some of the strictest laws on medical data. So we're actually following Maryland law because it covers the federal law. So we would just have to anonymize it if it ever went public. Or there's a whole process for medical researchers that they have to go through in order to have access to these records. But we can't just put the images out.
Right. And would you ultimately say that the railroad helped or hurt the Port of Baltimore? And what's the relationship between the two forms of transportation today?
They are intertwined and both responsible. I mean, the the success of both depended on each other. The railroad created the network of our country, and the harbor connected us to a global economy. And so it's the interface with which they met. And basically, all the industry around the harbor had its own rail connection. The entire harbor was surrounded by rail and rail connections in these industries. So I would say that's directly responsible, and the harbor is directly responsible for the success of the rail.
Yeah, terrific. Any other questions anyone has? Be sure and put them in the chat. Jonathan, I really appreciate your presentation today. I'm fascinated by the history of the B&O and its impact, not only in the local community, but sort of nationwide, because it's been such an instrumental transportation system for centuries.
Yeah, I mean, these days we're saying at the museum, we tell the story of America through the lens of the railroad. So I encourage you guys to come check us out, see some of our new exhibits, and see how it relates to our history.
I got one last question. You showed a painting of a 19th century Baltimore businessman. Where is that painting located?
I think we are talking about all the way back here, right?
The
This
group of,
one,
yeah.
this is the founders of the B&O Railroad. It's a fictitious meeting of 50 of the most influential early um, people who helped the B&O, but it's not all at the same time period. So we have from the founding fathers of the B&O to Samuel Morris in the 1870s here. This painting is on display in our museum in the first gallery
Oh,
under the museum. It used to hang in the B&O headquarters in Camden Station.
uh-huh.
PSX brought it to Jacksonville, so it was in their headquarters, and they donated it to us.
Very cool.
We also have a whole website built around this for students to learn about the early B&O and its relationship to Baltimore.
Fantastic. What great resources. I really appreciate. How much did the milder climate in Baltimore compared to the northern cities put it at an advantage as a port and a depot?
This is beyond my expertise, but at least from the rail perspective, I don't think, like, unless it was severe weather, I don't think it really made a difference. Like New York's railroad, Pennsylvania's railroad were all very successful. They had snow plows. They were clearing the track very quickly, just like the plows clear the highway.
Yeah,
But I don't know with the water, maybe if it's freezing, I don't.
ice free. Yeah. Jonathan, thank you so much. If anyone else has a question, be sure and post it in the chat box. How westward Baltimore is until this talk. Yeah, so lots of great insight from our participants today that you've shared. Great insight for
Yeah,
them.
you think of us being south, but we're southwest, which is a
Right,
different way of thinking about it.
right. We have a few more minutes. If anyone else has another question, we're happy to field that. Anyone? Okay. Thank you all for joining us today for there's another link in the site that someone just posted, the Internet of 19th Century. Um, Nancy Proctor shared. Be sure and visit that link in the chat box. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Kenyana, for hosting us and allowing us to present this. John, thank you so much for your help today, and we look forward to further programming with you and the B&O.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to do this.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great Friday.